Moltes gràcies per ser-hi, per tornar a aquesta segona keynote de Men in Movement. I will speak in English now, and I will present our fabulous keynote for today. As I was telling Brigitte Bargetz, she's one of my most fundamental political thinkers that I read all the time, that I always try to read, even when their articles are in German. And I use a lot of the Google Translate. And it's a pleasure to me to have her here with us in Barcelona at the Universitat Oferta de Catalunya. Brigitte is a senior postdoc and the principal investigator, together with Marcus Grisser, of the research project New Charity Economy Through the Lens of Effective Statehood at the Institute for Sociology and Social Research at the Vienna University of Economics and Business. She is co-editor of the feminist political science journal Feminipolitica, and member of the International Populism Research Network at the Kiel University, and an associate research fellow here in the network of Medusa at this institution at the Universitat Oferta de Catalunya. Her research interests lie at the intersection of affect studies, queer feminist theory, transformation of the social state, authoritarian populism, and critical theories of everyday. For the last couple years, she has also been working at the notion of critique and has engaged with the call of affirmative critique and the search for new political imaginaries, transformative potentialists, and other futures from new materialists, queer feminists, and post-colonial perspective. One of her most recent publications is Promises of Sovereignty in Authoritarian Populism, a feminist critique, but personally, I would recommend any of her works. So thank you for being here, Brigitte, and the floor is completely yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandra. This is way too kind for the introduction. I'm very honored to be here and to hear you talking about that the publications are interesting for your research too. And thanks, of course, to all of you, Begonia, Paco, Miguel, Sandra, again, for inviting me to this event. I'm very, very pleased to be here. And it has been a great honor and a great pleasure to be able to follow for the last, for this day and also for yesterday. I think we have already heard a lot about masculinism these days, and explicitly also about remasculinization and traditional masculinities yesterday and this morning in the panel. In some sense, I will continue in my talk these debates by speaking about what Lucas has called yesterday the promises of remasculinization. And I think today Elise and Evelina have also said a lot about masculinism, remasculinization in very specific places. So we've heard a lot and talked a lot about the incel culture, about memes. And what I will do in my talk is that I somehow will change the perspective in some sense. So I will not primarily talk about the far right, but rather move to the rather mainstream culture. And in order to do so, I will talk about literature today. So we have had different sorts of media already, but I will use literature in order to understand the contemporary moment of masculinism and of remasculinization. And in order to get you a first insight into what I mean by speaking about culture and about literature, I would like to start with a short video clip.
And that's why I don't know if it's a book, if it's a love letter from my father, if it's a book about love, but rather maybe it's a book about why is it so difficult to say I love you, you know? Why is it impossible sometimes to say I love you? And what I describe in the book is that someone like my father and many men in the social class and in the milieu in which I grew up, they were trapped by the masculinity. And the masculinity meant to never say I love you, to never express your feelings and everything. And so my father never told me, except when he was drunk a few times, he never told me I love you, you know?
So probably some of you know Edouard Louis. He's a French writer, and this is how Edouard Louis describes his 2018 published book, Who Killed My Father, in an interview with the British writer Carrie Hudson. So Edouard Louis, he has become a literary star in France and way beyond of France, and he's writing his autobiographic writing about growing up as a gay in a working class village has gained a lot of attention. So in this conversation with Carrie Hudson in the London Review Bookshop event, he explains how the milieu in which he grew up, where it was impossible, as he has said, for a man to express his feelings, has, among other things, destroyed his father's life. And this background is why, for him, love, or rather the ability to talk about love, is deeply political. So this is the book I'm talking about. As I've already said, Louis' autobiographical books about growing up gay in a working class context have gained a lot of attraction, and they have been widely debated because they have raised the important yet often ignored issue of class. In his book, Louis reveals, as Volker Wolkersdorf has once put it, and I quote, so in his book, Louis reveals class relations are always also experienced sexually, and that every form of sexuality has also an inherent class dimension, end of quote. Or if we look at Louis himself, he emphasizes, and I quote again, that's why I guess my sexuality is one of the reasons why I write about class this way. When I talk about the class identity of my father, I talk about sexuality, I talk about masculinity, end of quote. So in his books, Louis traces the entanglement of class and sexuality in his own personal stories. Yet he also shows how this personal relation goes beyond the merely personal and how it is embedded in structural power relations of gender and class. For Louis, literature is a medium of reflection. It is, as he mentions in another interview, a place of resistance and of truth. Autobiography, he tells, has surprisingly turned out to be subversive because it is a way of proving existence. Okay. And there you can see the second quote. Because when you do autobiography, Louis holds, you're saying to people who read you, these people exist. So what I would like to show that through his books, Louis creates a space for his own, but also for other marginalized voices in literature. By making his life and his own life visible and speakable, he opens up new spaces of identification. This form of writing oneself as a form of resistance, echoes what Black feminist Bell Hooks has once called talking back. In her 1989 book with the very same title, Hooks writes, and this is now the correct slide, moving from silence into speech is for the oppressed, the colonized, the exploited, and those who stand and struggle side by side a gesture of defiance that heals, that makes new life and new growth possible. It is that act of speech, of talking back, that is no more gesture of empty words, that is the expression of our movement from object to subject, the liberated voice, end of quote. So just as Hooks emphasizes here talking back as a form of expression of the oppressed and as a form of liberation, Edouard Louis calls for those voices to be heard in literature that often go unheard. Autobiographies can then become a means of writing against silencing. They are a form of subject constitution, and literature, autobiography can create spaces for new social imaginaries. In a similar way, Julian B. Carter, David Getzi, and Trish Salah write from a trans perspective about the broader political dimension of autobiography. And let me here quote what they write about doing autobiography. So autobiography, they write, takes the singularity of experience as its organizing principle and foregrounds the lone voice of its solitary, self-creating subject. Yet at the same time, such narratives perform that voices reach into a broader social world. So what they're saying here, autobiography is not only about writing about oneself, but it has explicitly political and wider structural dimensions. And of course, I guess it's here the same as in other places. Edouard Louis, with his books, is not alone when he writes about his autobiography. So we also have notions like autoethnography, autofiction, autotheory, autoanalysis, and all these different terms and forms of expression have been used recently in order to describe a trend in literature that gives credit to the so-called personal. Awarding the Nobel Prize for Literature to Annie Ernaux in 2022 has also confirmed this tendency of the autobiography. All these literature forms echo the slogan, "The personal is political," which was coined by the 1960s Black student movement in the US and which was taken up later by feminist movements worldwide. The slogan, "The personal is political," criticizes, among other things, the very gendered separation between public and private, and acknowledges that what is supposedly personal and private is also a side of political experience and of feminist knowledge production. So in my talk, what I will further argue and show is that I will take up this issue of politicizing the personal, which we could already see, or which you could already see with when I was talking about Edouard Louis. Yet I will go in a different direction, so I will not talk in the sense of feminist issues from the feminist personal is political, but rather I will look at politicizing the personal by engaging with contemporary struggles over masculinities and more precisely with male autofiction. However, I will move from Edouard Louis to another example, namely the widely discussed 6-volume epic called Min Kamp by Norwegian author Karl Ove Knausgaard. And to give you a first insight, this is the 6-volume epic Min Kamp by Knausgaard. So I would like to say in advance that when I do engage with autofiction, I do not speak from a literature studies perspective. And above all, I wouldn't be able to do so because what I've heard also from the kind introduction, I'm not a literary scholar, but a social science scholar in political science. So as I've said in the very beginning, what is interesting for me is to look at literature, at fiction from a political perspective, and to ask what literature can politically do in this contemporary moment. So that's my take on literature. So if there's any one of you from literature studies, please forgive me, so you know that this is not my background. But I've been asking myself over the last couple of years when I've been working on authoritarian populism from a gender perspective, from an affect perspective, from a masculinism perspective, I've also been asking myself, where is the medium? Where do different forms of masculinization, of remasculinization take place? And today I would like to discuss with you what we maybe learn also when we look at literature and when we look at mainstream literature that has become very prominent and what it does say about remasculinization and masculinism. So I will argue in my talk that Knausgaard's epic, so these 6 volumes that you can already see here, is a contribution to better understanding ongoing struggles over hegemonic masculinities and how they are embedded in the contradictions of male violence and vulnerability. However, these contradictions of male violence and vulnerability are only one part of the story, And I will further discuss how this form of male autofiction also, and perhaps also paradoxically, feeds into a widely shared frame of an endangered masculinities, and how it therefore also contributes to further nourishing right-wing calls for remasculinization. So what I will do is I will talk a little bit about what this 6-volume epic can tell us about vulnerabilities and masculinities. And on the one hand side, I will show that there is a pretty new way also of engaging with masculinities. And on the other hand, I will also argue, or I will try to bring the far-right tendency of masculinization together with this novel and ask what it says if we think together these two different tendencies. So this is kind of the argument or the way I would like to engage. In order to do this way, I will first go into Knausgaard's 6-volume epic, also present a little bit what has been going on and show how this book can give new insights into contemporary struggles over masculinity. In the second and in the third step, I will elaborate more on the critical reading of Knausgaard and why I think that his works feeds into contemporary populist masculinism. So while I start digging out the ambivalences of the masculine care for the self that this epic reveals in part 2, I will afterwards engage with Knausgaard's reading of Hitler, and probably you have already heard about this, or Mein Kampf already shows why it is important also to talk about Knausgaard's reading of Hitler. And I will then conclude by summarizing how Knausgaard's Mein Kampf and contemporary tendencies of remasculinization meet, and thus why I think it might be insightful to look at popular culture, to look at literature, in order to learn more about the contemporary political tendencies. So this is the way I would like you to invite you to come with me and take the journey through this book. So let me start with the first part, my struggle into pain and shame. In only 2 years' time, between 2009 and 2011, Norwegian author Karl Ove Knausgaard published a 6-volume epic entitled Mein Kampf, My Struggle. Mein Kampf is a radical autobiographical work which has also contributed to popularize so-called autofiction. In a very short time, Mein Kampf has become a bestseller worldwide and has meanwhile been translated in about 30 languages. And I hope I got the pictures right, that I got the Catalan translation of Mein Kampf. And may I ask you if there's anyone who has heard or read Mein Kampf in the audience? Okay. So just to get a glimpse, but you will soon know more about it. For fellow writer Rachel Cusk, Mein Kampf is, and I quote, perhaps the most significant literary enterprise of our times. The Danish liberal left daily newspaper Politiken claims that Knausgaard's sufferings may become as significant literally and spiritually for the people of the 2010s as those of young Werther in the 70s. And for his readers, one could even speak of a Knausgaard mania. In some workplaces in Norway, employers proclaimed Knausgaard-free days, which meant that the staff were forbidden to talk about his book. So I think this makes already very clear how many people have read Knausgaard also in Norway. A quick search on the web shows how famous this novel series has become. And I would like to give you some short insights. I have chosen 2 clips that I would like to share with you.
Karl Ove Knausgaard is an unlikely literary celebrity. The Norwegian novelist is the author of the best-selling 6-volume novelized memoir, My Struggle, Mein Kampf in Norwegian, a title deliberately and somewhat controversially borrowed from Adolf Hitler's autobiography, Mein Kampf. As Knausgaard readily acknowledges, they're books without much of a plot, where quotidian events are described with exacting and sometimes exhausting detail. In Norway, a country of just 5 million people, My Struggle has sold 450,000 copies. English language critics regularly compare him to Proust and await the translation of each new volume with childlike anticipation.
The This man dreamt of being a great writer, and some say he is. He's certainly successful and becoming well known. He did it by writing about his life in an extraordinary way, a long hypnotic saga, 3,500 pages, provocatively entitled My Struggle, Mein Kampf. It included everything from the apparently banal, savouring a cup of tea.
After a while, I picked up the teapot and poured. Dark brown, almost like wood, the tea rose inside the white cup.
To his feelings about his father.
I had long wished him dead. But from the very second I realized his life could soon be over, I began to hope for it.
Indeed, as the short clips already reveal, Mein Kampf describes a struggle about the banalities of the everyday. So when he was talking about the tea. In a marathon description, as you've already heard, of almost 4,000 pages, Mein Kampf illustrates Knausgard's search for a meaningful existence and for the daily enjoyment of life. In his book, Knausgard turns in detail to his everyday life. His everyday life is, as you can see on this cartoon picturing Knausgard, often about housework, about the mundane and exhausting necessities of combining family, children, and his career as a writer, and therefore about Knausgard's longing for what Virginia Woolf has once called a room of one's own. By exploring exhaustively the repetitive nature of the everyday, from pouring tea over changing children diapers to cigarette breaks, Knausgard tells in depth, as one critique writes, what it means to be a human being of the present, or, as I would rather say, what it means to be a man of the present. Knausgard's readers get detailed insights into the contradictory experiences of masculinity of a well-educated, white, middle-class, heterosexual male who is about to become a star. His experiences reveal masculine relations of violence as much as the author's insecurities. They exhibit Knausgard's search for an identity that allows him to get over his own experiences and to develop new relations with the self and with the world. Most of all, Knausgard's epic autofiction is a reflection about his origins, and above all, and you have already heard it in the short clip, it is a reflection about his relationship with his father. Almost everything in his text, Knausgard emphasizes in the 5th volume entitled Some Rain Must Fall, is in some way about his father. About a father described as tyrannical, cold, authoritarian father, a man children feared and who later drank himself to death, as Knausgard writes himself. Mein Kampf is thus about prohibition, humiliation, and violence. It is about Knausgard's continuous struggle for paternal recognition and again about his shame of his father and about being shamed by him. On a personal level, Knausgard's writing about his relation with his father and the description of his father's life led his father's family to sue him. On a public and academic level, these deeply personal descriptions of shame and pain, these moments of relentless self-exposures, have gained huge public attention and also admiration. According to literary scholar Tony Tolan, and I quote, such radical disclosure of the relationship between father and son since earliest childhood, the equally intense and extensive description of the first person's narrator as entanglement in the basic psychological disposition of his father's predecessor is, in this form, hardly known in literature. End of quote. For Knausgard himself, the issue of shame has been much more ordinary, as he confesses in an interview with British writer Sadie Smith. And I would like to show a short video clip again.
I wondered if shame is the thing that you're bringing up from the depth, or is shame, that's the purpose of shame in these books, to try and get deeper.
Yeah. I'm a very intuitive writer, you know. And the freedom of this book was that I just could write. I could just, you know, do it as the best I could, but I could just write. So there was no thought of reinventing or doing anything new at all. And I don't think I have, but I think I got kind of close to myself. And being so close to yourself, I don't know what shame is. My first novel I wrote, it is not a self-biographical novel, but it has lots of elements, of course, of me in it. And my editor wrote the text on the back, and he called it a monument of male shame.
Right.
And I said, what? What do you mean? I wasn't aware of the book was about shame, because I am so full of shame. And that was the way I thought the world was like, you know?
I hope you get a good impression about what these books are about in writing about shame. And it is exactly this kind of ordinariness of Knausgaard's daily existence in shame that has made his books very appealing for many of his readers. For literary scholar Toril Moy, this ordinariness is breathtaking, and this is a quote. Her own reading has happened almost intravenously, as she confesses. She writes, I was hooked from the start. The publication schedule was addictive. Every 2 or 3 months or so, I needed my Knausgaard fix. For Moy, Knausgaard's descriptions of the ordinariness of existence reveal his powers of imagination and express his creativity. So I would say that if we look at the reception, but also at the books themselves, Knausgaard's books are insightful for learning about specific contemporary struggles of a white middle-class heterosexual man living in the north of Europe from the perspective of his personal own experiences. This is why Knausgaard's radical memorizing of his struggles contributes to a more comprehensive, albeit always selective, understanding of contemporary masculinities. His book can make accessible male modes of subjectivation as well as masculine feeling rules. And in this way, his descriptions lead to a better understanding of the complex configurations of hegemonic masculinity and how they are part of the contradictions of male violence and vulnerability. So I think that this is the way how this epic has been very inspiring and could show from a very personal perspective the contradictions of male violence in the sense of hegemonic masculinity. Yet as much as Knausgaard descriptions have become addictive and provide new insights about contemporary experiences and feelings of masculinity, I think that they also leave open some important questions. Questions that make this mammoth biography of an ordinary man, as I will further argue, prone to a particular masculinist politics. And this is how I will come to the second part. From a feminist perspective, the widely held fascination with Knausgaard's monumental work also raises some questions. What if the 6 volumes had been written by a similarly positioned woman? Would the seemingly endless pages about the everyday have equally been received, even absorbed, by critics and readers alike? Would there be a similar hype, novelist Katie Roffey asks, if the books had been written by, let's say, Carla Olivia Krauss from a hip LA neighborhood? Likewise, writer Siri Hustvedt brings to the fore the necessity of a feminist perspective when trying to grasp the phenomenon Knausgaard. Knausgaard, Hustvedt explains, writes a lot about his feelings, and he persists at it even when he is humiliated in the process, when he looks like a fool and a ninny. Such fearless openness is fascinating in anyone, but maybe more fascinating in a man, because a man who reveals his feelings is at greater risk of being shamed for those revelations. End of quote. But, Hustvedt continues, what if this immensely long personal saga, this veritable swamp of lachrymosity, and these are quotes again, had been written by a woman? And would a new form of writing have also been named after a female, trans, lesbian, black, or disabled positioned writer, as was the case with Knausgaard, who was attested a new style of existential realism? These questions are all the more timely since recently female novelists writing about themselves have often been accused of oversharing. And still, Knausgaard books are insightful because writing about oneself is also part of a care of the self, and this is an expression that has been coined by Michel Foucault. Taking his cue from ancient Greek and Roman practices, Foucault's care for the selves is a practice and technology where individuals care for themselves by telling the truth about themselves. Writing about oneself, Michel Foucault notes in his essay Self-Writing, and I quote, offers what one has done or thought to a possible gaze. The fact of obliging oneself to write plays the role of a companion by giving rise to the fear of disapproval and to shame. End of quote. So in this sense, the care for the self, writing about oneself, is both a public and a risky practice. And in that sense, it is also political because it shows something. And I think also in this sense, Foucault's care for the self resonates pretty well with Knausgaard's radical self-descriptions. And more than that, at first glance, Knausgaard's care for the self also seems to refer to current debates about caring masculinities. And we've heard a lot about caring masculinities yesterday, and I'm glad that we already got some very well introduction about what that means. So caring masculinities are about men who reject domination and who embrace often feminized values and practices such as care, emotions, and relationality. The term care here relates to caring for children, for the elderly and other people in need of care, and therefore to labor that has traditionally been feminized and often also racialized in capitalist societies. Yet care also means more than that. It refers to care as a principle that encompasses all areas of everyday life. And I think we have had a good way to understand this yesterday in the first panel. At second glance, however, Knausgaard's care for the self proves to be much more ambivalent, I would like to argue. Even though Knausgaard writes a lot about his family and his wife, a fellow writer, dedicating, for instance, a huge part of his last book on his wife's depression, his fictional autobiography, as well as the reception of the autobiography, are ultimately mainly about Knausgaard's masculinity. It is a form of masculinity that appears equally unapproachable and vulnerable, and most of all, it is broadly acknowledged as an exciting novelty in need for analysis. So from this perspective, Knausgaard's popularized autofiction, his care for the self, becomes primarily a masculine account of the self. Ultimately, his care for the self might even be framed as individualistic or even narcissistic, and thus as symptomatically masculine. So the masculine care for the self puts Knausgaard's self-writing, although certainly not intentionally, as I would claim, in close proximity to populist discussions about the so-called crisis of masculinity, and we've already heard about the crisis of masculinity also earlier on. For sure, Knausgaard's autofiction radically differs from contemporary right-wing masculinism when he reveals in his narration his vulnerability and his own struggles with hegemonic masculinity. So while Knausgaard's narratives of pain and shame are therefore a critique of patriarchal masculinity, the contemporary right-wing populist remasculization rather regrets the loss of this form of masculinity. For the far right and right-wing populists, it is not patriarchy, but feminism that is supposedly responsible for the loss of masculine virtues and insecure masculinity. So there we see the different direction where these understandings of masculinity go. And still, I would argue, somehow these two different phenomena, so Knausgaard's autobiographical stories of suffering and far-right masculinism, I would argue they also merge. Knausgaard's ordinary struggles, his descriptions of masculinity in shame, paradoxically feeds into the widely shared contemporary framing of an endangered masculinity, since both tendencies refer to a narrative of male victimhood. In this sense, Knausgaard's autofiction becomes an effective narrative, to use an expression I have developed together with my colleague Nina Eggers in a different context. Mein Kampf can create effective attachments. It brings to the fore expressions of male victimhood of an ordinary man, and this is how it may offer spaces of identification for other men. And such a reading, so bringing these different expressions of masculinities together, is fueled even more, as I would argue, when looking at Knausgaard's final volume in his struggle series. So let me then turn to the third part of my talk, the populist flirt with Hitler. Hardly surprising, Knausgaard's title, Mein Kampf, has provoked much critique. In the German translation, this title has even been banished for also well-known reasons. When being asked about why naming a book after Hitler's, Knausgaard points out that this has been due to unsatisfactory working titles and a subsequent suggestion by a friend. In an interview in 2017, Knausgaard furthermore highlights the shift in meaning that his book has provoked. Let me quote here. The funny thing is that when people talk about Mein Kampf in Norway today, they mean the book I wrote. When one means Hitler, one says Mein Kampf. That was also Mein Kampf before, so my book has reclaimed something, and I liked it. End of quote. Still, reading Knausgaard's sixth and final volume, The End, the reader keeps wondering what this is all about when Knausgaard discusses young Hitler on almost 400 pages out of 1,200. Here, Knausgaard not only summarizes and quotes Hitler at length, he also parallels his own struggles with Hitler's ambitions, with his doubts, weaknesses, as historian Christopher Clark observes, with his love for his mother, his struggle with an authoritarian father, and his refusal to the destinies prescribed by him by convention. Knausgaard, in this book, aims to get close to Hitler. He wants to take hold of Hitler not as the evil man, as he has been portrayed in most academic writing, as Knausgaard critically charges, but as an ordinary man. We are opposed, writes Knausgaard in his sixth volume, and rightly so, to everything Hitler stood for. Hitler is our antithesis, but only in respect of what he did, not in terms of the person he was. In that he was like us. Hitler's youth resembles my own, his remote infatuation, his desperate desire to be someone, to rise above the self, his love for his mother, his hatred of his father, his use of art as a space of great emotions in which the I could be erased. His problems forming relationships with his others, his elevation of women, his anxiety in their company, his chasticity, his yearning for purity. End of quote. And in a speech given when receiving the literature prize of the German daily newspaper, the Welt, the World, in 2015, he states, "We have an image of this man, Adolf Hitler, and we see that image from a great distance because we have to shield ourselves from what he stood for. If we lift this distance, we see a man who built a distance with everyone around him in order to survive." End of quote. Yet Knausgaard not only parallels his own struggles with those of Hitler. By emphasizing his effort to getting closer to Hitler, he also accuses historians and other scholars for merely adopting a dismissive attitude towards the young Hitler, of failing to warm the passion and innocence of his subject, as one critique notes. Such an understanding of Hitler, Knausgaard teaches his readers, is, and I quote, immature, and makes Kershaw's Hitler biography almost unreadable. Because, as Knausgaard asks, is it possible for everything a person does, even when that person is 16 years old, to be appalling and bad? End of quote. Instead, we learn about Hitler's unease with social justice in Knausgaard. Hitler, Knausgaard also claims in his last volume, and I quote, recognized poverty as a major political problem, and he was just as distraught about its inhumanity as Karl Marx and Jack London. End of quote. Here, at the latest, when claiming a similarity between Marx and Hitler in terms of social inequality, Knausgaard's way of writing, his overtly immediate descriptions that he invokes against any critical reflection from the distance, becomes most problematic. Not only does one ask how he, Knausgard, would know all this about Hitler's desires and feelings. By claiming to be able to get close to Hitler, in contrast to most academic research, he utterly delegitimizes this whole research. Doing so, he also ignores, as historian Christopher Clark writes in his critique, the complex history of Nazi occupation in Norway and the impact this has had on the country. And for the US-based writer Charles Finch, an overall admirer of Knausgard's work, the passages about Hitler represent, and I quote, the arrogance, grandiosity, and laziness of a loud-mouthed white man who insists he is worth 4,000 pages of your time. End of quote. Knausgard's flirt with Hitler is not only populist because he pays tribute to an attention economy when calling his book My Struggle, Mein Kampf. His descriptive style of acknowledging feelings is also a populist flirt because he offers a moral economy beyond politics when rereading Hitler. Hitler was, as Knausgard emphasizes, and I quote, a small person. But, as he continues, so are we all. He must not be judged for what he was, but for what he did. What he did, however, he didn't do alone. End of quote. By trying, as it seems, to somehow rescue Hitler, Knausgard's Mein Kampf, and here I agree with German writer Angelika Klüssendorf, is not only ignorant, but all the more dangerous. And why is it dangerous? And what can these observations in view of Knausgard's work tell about the issue of masculinism and remasculinization in the contemporary moment? So I would like to come to my conclusion then. In my talk, I have been interested in the politics of Knausgard's monumental work, Mein Kampf, understanding popular culture also as political, as a field of struggles, and as a means of individual and collective sense-making. I have been wondering about what a book like Knausgard's Mein Kampf can politically do. Knausgard's epic work has been published in a moment which is not only characterized by a so-called autofictional turn. It is also a moment of contested masculinity, of narratives about a crisis of masculinity, and of a hailing for remasculinization. This becomes particularly visible in movements of right-wing populism and the far right, however, not exclusively. Mourning the loss of masculinity, as well as the issue of suffering that this loss is said to bring about, has been discussed widely in recent years, way beyond the far right. This is what Kara New-Daggett, for instance, has in mind when she speaks about so-called petromasculinity. Petromasculinism refers, among others, to the male discourse about the car as an expression of power and freedom. So petromasculinism then describes a masculinist practice of compensating the loss of masculinity and of longing for the restoration of male agency and sovereignty. So this is where we can see that there is a common ground with a sense of remasculinization on a broader level. Masculinist movements and discourses like these have been on the rise, while Knausgard has published his 4,000 pages of male pain and shame. In this synchronicity, these two tendencies also resonate with each other. Although Knausgard's personal crisis of masculinity is, as he describes, an effect of the masculine violence of patriarchy, I would also argue that this critique of patriarchy is often ignored or even silenced in public debates. So I think we can understand, or it is possible to understand, Knausgard also as an expression of male violence in a patriarchal system. But I would say that this critique of patriarchy that becomes visible in Knausgard's writing is very often de-articulated in public discourses and also in the way how his books have been publicly debated. In these debates, they do not so much refer to the politics of the personal, that is, the structural aspects of personal experiences. most public debates are less about the conditions of male violence, which has, among other things, produced Knausgaard's suffering. Rather, Knausgaard's self-writing, his personal stories, and his vulnerability are in the very center of the debates and of the reception. I would even argue that a form of depoliticizing the personal becomes visible here. Because ultimately, all is about the very individual Knausgaard himself, this male yet suffering hero. And it is because of this kind of depoliticization of writing out the structural conditions of male suffering, as I would further argue, that Knausgaard's crisis can publicly merge with contemporary debates about a crisis of masculinity. And still, as I have also tried to show in my last part of the talk, Mein Kampf itself, in some sense, also nourishes this connection, when Knausgaard parallels his own weaknesses with Hitler's. By assuming and emphasizing these similarities, he ultimately depoliticizes any engagement with Hitler fascism and anti-Semitism. In that sense, Mein Kampf may admittedly not be an expression of right-wing populism or of authoritarian populism. However, I would argue it can contribute to further setting the ground for these politics. And by doing so, this popularized autofiction becomes deeply political. In my reading, I am therefore, and I would like to emphasize this again, I'm not equating Knausgaard and my struggle with tendencies of right-wing remasculinization. So let me be clear here again. However, I think it is crucial in this current political moment to search for and critically engage with remasculinization and resovereignization in different fields and in various forms of expression. And this is what I have been trying to do in this talk when looking on the ambivalent politics of Knausgaard works. And looking at the different sides means, consequently, to also look at sides where these tendencies might not even be suspected. One such side where perhaps remasculinization might not even be suspected is the six-volume epic Mein Kampf. Since it feeds into widely shared frame of endangered masculinity and thus contributes to further nourishing right-wing calls for remasculinization. Thank you.
Thank you.